The time has finally come once again. The Duelist Cup is approaching in Master Duel, and duelists will now have their chance to earn an invite to the World Championship for a chance to claim the title that every duelist aims for. So for those of you looking to compete, or just to see what the best deck is and play ranked or climb the ladder in Master Duel, then this is the video for you. We're going to discuss what the best decks are in the metagame right now, as well as what decks you should avoid, what decks are fine choices, what are strangely strong positioned, and how their new releases fare up, like the almighty Blue Eyes White Dragon and the brand new support that has just come out. But before we get into the video, if you guys enjoy these tier lists where we discuss the meta in its entirety and talk about what the best options are, then please consider liking, subscribing, as well as commenting down below that these videos are worth doing for me, as well as if you have any feedback on the list itself, then feel free to engage in a respectful discussion talking about why or why not I may be wrong about some of my evaluations. But with that being said, let's get into the tier list. So I'm not going to beat around the bush. First up, let's talk about some of the best decks in the Yu-Gi-Oh metagame. In Master Duel, the February pack released a wave of new cards that upended the metagame in its entirety. There's no denying that we reverted back to a Snake Eyes dominant format. Though within Snake Eyes, there are a variety of options that players could use that give them some different upsides and downsides depending on what's popular at the time. Of course, Snake Eyes got a boost with the Snake Eyes card directly, Snake Eyes Doom Dragon, as well as with support from the Azamina cards, which have direct tie-ins to the Snake Eye archetype. I also got more indirect support with the Fiendsmith cards, and even the Millennium cards, which have been used to bolster their capabilities. Now that being said, what are the best versions of Snake Eyes? Which of these would you define as the best decks? Is it all of them? Well, no, I don't think every single version of Snake Eye can be considered the best deck. Now, there are two versions of Snake Eyes that I do consider to be the best decks right now. They're both Snake Eyes with the addition of Fiendsmith, as well as one more engine. The Fiendsmith cards give a lot of power to Snake Eyes. It's something we saw very clearly in the TCG back in July. And of course, the formats aren't direct parallels, with some cards in Snake Eyes and Fiendsmith already being hit in Master Duel, where they were at full power in the TCG back when we played it. For that reason, I don't think playing this but just playing just as two engines is enough. You do want a little more oomph to make up for the cards you've lost in the limits and restrictions, as well as to give you consistency. Now, if you want to play a more pure, I guess, Snake Eyes Fiendsmith deck, it is somewhat still viable. I just think you will struggle on the consistency end, as well as sometimes breaking through fields if they're able to establish your engine won't be able to push through as neatly. But I did say there are two viable engines. Now, the first one is the Azamina one, which we already talked about. Now, this is the standard option. It is widely considered to be the best Master Duel deck at the moment. However, I'd argue that it maybe teeters at the lower edge of one of the best decks, and I actually think there might be an even better option at the moment. Now, why is the Snake Eye Azamina deck so good? Well, because it has all the makings of a combo deck while being kind of shaped like a mid-range deck. It can fit in a large amount of non-engine and hand traps to combat many other different decks. But when it goes first, it can string together powerful combos with one or two cards that are as good as what you see pendulum decks do or tier decks. Whether it be monster negates, removal, and now spell and trap negates things to Silva and Desiree, there's not much you can do to it. And it's big specifically that you now have spell and trap negates, because before that's something that Snake Eye Fields lacked. It was a weak point in the metagame that we were able to capitalize on when we played combo decks. Say, the entire design for my Talent deck last year with the World Championship was when playing against Snake Eyes, they could really only end on Appaloosa as far as negation goes. Anything beyond that would be removal, and that meant power spells had the ability to go right through the Snake Eye field. Cards like Talents, Grass, Change of Heart even had a chance, but now they just trade directly 1-for-1 into the Snake Eye fields, and when they have like 10 interrupts, trading 1-for-1 in the 6-card hand will not cut it. This deck is also fairly playable going second, as you have the normal pushes with Snake Eye cards, you also have the Fiendsmith cards to help you play through fields, and then the Azamina cards could deal the final blow by converting back into Snake Eyes cards, getting the Flamebird, and then going for lethal shots. But it's not without weaknesses. The biggest one for me is it is fairly weak to cards like Molcharmi Fualos and Joel Lockbird, which are seeing a lot of play, and then does have choke points with Bestials, where Bestials can be good against both the Fiendsmith cards and the Azamina cards, and they're not even bad versus IP Masquerena either, meaning that when you have multiple hand traps paired together, the Snake-Eye deck can crumble. As well as another interesting one that's popped up is the play rate of Retaliating Sea. Retaliating Sea being used on Hallowed Azamina is destruction, as you already trade a card away to use the deception, and then afterwards you walk away with nothing, while also having to deal with the macrocosmos that is Retaliating Sea on the opponent's field. And this is even better than in the TCG, because now when that Retaliating Sea hits the graveyard, it'll convert into a maxi, meaning if you can kill it that turn, unless you're banishing it or putting small trap card zone, it's going to be an even bigger problem in the future. Now, it's hard to know whether this will be a mainstay in the meta. It has seen some play in top ranked decks, and in the Duelist Cup, metas can evolve hour by hour almost, especially in the later hours and days of the tournament. If we're seeing the top end players all playing Snake-Eye Azamina, there's a very good chance we see the shift to Retaliating Sea being in everyone's deck. Now, Retaliating Sea does have other uses versus this deck as well, as you can hit original Sinful Spoils. It's important to note, though, that it is a lot easier to play around Retaliating Sea if you know it's in the metagame, and your only way of activating it is via the original. Either way, though, it is still very manageable in comparison when you're playing without the Azamina cards into Retaliating Sea. Thusly, if you're starting your turn off with Witch or Deception, Retaliating Sea is reliable if that's the game plan of these Fiendsmith Azamina decks. Now, there is also one other problem with this deck that does kind of rub me the wrong way, and that is extra deck space. You see, in the TCG, we were never really given a format where all these decks could combine together. By the time we got the Azamina cards in Rage of the Abyss in the TCG, the Fiends of the cards already had some hits in them. Importantly, Lacrima and Beatrice had already been forbidden, as well as Appaloosa had already been banned. And the extra deck was still tight for the Rage of the Abyss extra deck, because the Azamina cards do take up 2 spots, and they do still lend yourself to wanting to play other extra deck cards like Dark Charmer, which is good in the mirror match. And if you cut too many end board pieces, like say you cut Desiree, then you find yourself in the same problem as before, where now you lack spell and trap negates. So some of these options are why I question if the Azamina Snake-Eye Fiendsmith deck is the single best version of the deck. And I'm almost leaning towards the secondary version of the deck to be the prime best deck. And the other variant is Snake-Eye Fiendsmith Millennium. This is a little bit of a new and old innovation. It's something that we toyed around with briefly in the TCG metagame, but it never really took off, and there might be a couple reasons for it. However, recently in Master Duel, we've seen more and more players start to pick it up as the new kind of leading playstyle for Snake Eyes amongst top-ranked players. And as the cat's out of the bag, I expect this deck to be relatively popular in the Duelist Cup. Now, what is this deck? Why play Millennium cards? So this deck is for the most part just Snake-Eye Fiendsmith, with the addition of 5 Millennium cards, 2 Sengajin, 2 Golems, and 1 Wedgie Temple. You can use Millennium cards as a way to generate bodies for link fodder. We've explored this idea in other decks in the past, like Telement, where you can go Sengajin, get Golem, Golem get Temple, Temple, burn a monster in your hand to place itself in shield, summon shield, and from there, you can go to Curious or turn the 2 monsters into Closed Moon, and to the Fiendsmith cards, and then the 2 6s, the Golem and the Engraver, into Beatrice. That's something we can do in combo decks, but that also works for Snake Eyes, because Snake Eyes really is just a combo deck with mid-range clothing, it feels like. I don't know why I can play so many hand traps, it's stupid. Now, I guess the reason why it wasn't played in the TCG before is largely because we didn't need to. With 3 Engravers and 3 Bonfires and 3 Snake-Eye Ash, you didn't need the consistency. But with the Millennium cards and the Fiendsmith cards in Master Duel, you can draw a hand with no Snake-Eye cards. You're still converting to Snake-Eye cards via either Beatrice or milling off Zombie Vampire. Now, you may wonder as well, how do you get to Zombie Vampire in this deck with the Sengajin being level 8, but none of the other Millennium cards being level 8? Now, that's because instead of placing a shield off of Wedgie Temple, the extra place you'll have in this deck, you'll place another Millennium card, and then you can send 2 spells and trap and monster form to the grave to summon Snake Eye's Doom Dragon. Now, this is in addition to the deck that I didn't think would be so powerful, seeing as in the TCG we only just got into Supreme Darkness and never got to live alongside Snake Eyes in its prime. But playing with this card feels really powerful. It's another extender out of the extra deck that costs you essentially nothing, that really helps break through fields and follow-up, as well as to establish your field. And it has this extra synergy with the Millennium cards, giving you access to more bodies, lets you not play shield, as well as make the rank 8s now. Now, the other option for rank 8s is to play the number 90 Photon Lord for monster negate. However, that is weak to Imperm, and I'd rather make Vampire, as that should play through the disruption as opposed to negating it. And with Appaloosa in the format, I feel no need to provide the extra monster negate right now. So yeah. And obviously this deck includes no Millennium Onks or Exodia pieces because those are bricks. You're not trying to rely on those. You really are just willingly paying 2,000 life points to summon monsters. They're just like Destrudo, and that's okay. And then obviously if you need to, these could also convert into Fiendsmith cards, which again, of themselves also can turn into Snake Eyes via Beatrice and Princess. Now, one of the big things with this deck is not having that same weakness to Fatality. You can also summon monsters really aggressively without playing into Full Loss, as summoning the Millennium monsters summons from the Spell Trap card zone. And you get Full Loss, you can make some decent board positions still, as well as you can kill relatively easily under Maxi and Full Loss, and not have to worry about them drawing into Nibiru, with Golem plus Snake Eyes Doom Dragon and Sengagen alone being enough to go for lethal and clear a monster. It also has the weird bonus advantage of letting you masquerade as a Millennium deck for the first few actions of the turn. This means potentially eating cards like Ash Blossom on the Millennium cards that you could then just convert later into Snake Eyes fodder or into Doom Dragon rather uninterrupted. So far for me, this has been the Snake Eyes deck to look out for, as it feels very powerful, consistent, and doesn't have as many weaknesses, especially the more extra deck spots, as the other Snake Eyes as a Mina variant. That being said, both decks are still very powerful and sit at the top of the best decks. But one other deck joins them, and it is not a Snake Eyes variant. It's a Dragon deck, and it's not Blue Eyes. I'm sorry, it is Tenpai. And I was joking, we don't love this deck, but it makes sense. So some of the best tech cards in this format we've talked about already are cards like Droll and Lockbird, as well as Molcharmy Fuwalas, and both those can be played pretty easily in Tenpai, and don't hurt Tenpai nearly as much, but also Molcharmy Perulia is very good versus Snake Eyes. It's not like game breaking, but it is good. Obviously the restrictions do hurt Tenpai. We have seen some more serious hits come down, like Kaiman to 2, Sangan summoning to 1, and Chandra to 1, but there are workarounds. Right now we've seen experimentation with Gold Sarcophagus, being able to banish Blaster from the deck and add Chandra from deck to hand. Interestingly, one tech that I saw Trishula play in a stream was Lunalight Kaleidochick, the card you can banish off Gold Sark, and as a Lunalight player myself, that's where my UDS belt comes from, I won with Lunalights. You'll know that if Kaleidochick is banished for some random reason, it has this effect where you can activate it, and then during the battle phase of that turn, your opponent can't use card effects. I don't know why that has that effect. It's kind of stupid and unfair, and normally it doesn't matter because battle phase effects aren't that important, but effing Tenpai, man? Like, come on, why does it need that? But then obviously versus Snake Eye is notorious for its ability to play through 1 or 2 hand traps very well. Where it starts to get dicey is around the 3rd hand trap, and then it all starts to fall apart very quickly. Tenpai, more than any other deck, can really afford to do that. It also synergizes well with Bestials, being good for grind games, and Bestials are good right now, hitting both Fiendsmith and Azamina cards. So overall, I still think Tenpai is in a prime position for this format. Now that wraps up the decks that I think are the absolute best for this Duelist Cup and for this monthly format. Now before we continue on with the tier list, I'd like to address 2 decks that I cannot really assess that well. Now the first up is the Galaxy Eyes deck. With the brand new Tachyon support, it is somewhat poised to be stronger. Some of these cards read custom, being able to summon a lot more monsters, a lot more fast. Yeah, nice wording, Jesse. But still, yeah, they have better access to negates, better access to play through fields, better access to play like a modern deck. But it's a deck we don't have in the TCG, or we're just getting in Maze and the Master. It hasn't seen much success in the OCG, so I'm not sure if that's because the climate in the format was never right there, or if it's just not good, or if it's never solved there. Now, if I had to probably rank it, I'd put this in a poor choice section. That's because I think most combo-like decks kind of will struggle right now, as they're competing against Snake Eyes, which does the same thing. In my head, that's where I imagine Galaxy Eyes right now, but I need more data before I can really tell. The same goes for the new ABC Union Kaiba variant that also has not seen success in Japan, but the cards looked very good, giving the deck a lot more actual plays on turn 1, extension, and importantly consistency, because ABC Buster Dragon is an incredibly powerful card. It's still good removal with insanely good follow-up. It has good link fodder. It has very little in terms of restriction. In fact, that's kind of like nothing. The biggest problem has always been kind of consistency and brickiness, because the ABC pieces themselves are not terrible, but they're clearly lacking in power level compared to cards like Union Hanger. So giving the deck more tools to cope, it actually could be pretty good. but it hasn't done anything in OCG, and having not had a chance to play it in the TCG yet, or in Master Duel, I still want to see how good it'll be. But alright, with that out of the way, let's start working our way up. Let's look at the decks we should stay away from, in my opinion. Now, with these decks, there are 3 common factors that I think binds them all together, or we'll classify each of these decks into one of these 3 or multiple categories. These are decks that I think are inconsistent, so they're not good for a long haul tournament. They're simply power crept and no longer keep up with the decks of the modern era, or ability to combat a field just are insufficient. And then lastly, we have the turbo combo decks, a deck type that I typically pretty love and rely on engine and board breaking to push through a field. And then when they go first, can do a lot through a lot of hand traps. Now, those decks have a bit of a problem right now. For one, Fuba loss exists, but in many cases, you just sit there, scratch your head and say, pass. That's not reliable for a long tournament run, especially when now there are 2 Maxi and 3 Charmy. So 5 cards that threaten your existence every single time you go first. Now, not every game where you get Maxi is unsalvageable or Fuba lost. We've seen that many times. Either you deck them out, or you make half fields, or you do have the answer to it, but still, it's very much a nuisance. And to say otherwise would be ignorance. Like, as a tier player myself, I'm not gonna, even though I've beaten Maxi many, many times, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that I want my opponent to Maxi me, because God knows, it's very frustrating when it happens still. But then, there's also the problem of a Duel and Lockbird being in the format. Duel and Lockbird eats up combo decks for breakfast and shits them out. They get caught in the crossfire even harder than Snake-Eye does, truthfully. Currently in my decks, I'm looking at playing Droll even more so than Infinite Veiler, and if you're playing a deck that is weak to Droll, making sure you have it in your deck at least as one of as a cross-out target. But then lastly, the other problem with these combo decks is the existence of Snake-Eyes. Now remember, before I said your entire game plan was to push through fields, but Snake-Eyes is not a mid-range deck. Like, calling it the mid-range deck because it plays 20 non-engine, like hand traps and such, would be ridiculous. Appaloosa is one thing to deal with, and most mid-range decks can pump out an Appaloosa, but the effing Desiree with a Sylvia, it's a lot. It becomes too much for these decks to handle, and I think trying to break these fields is not feasible. You have to hand trap them. That's just not how these combo decks are designed. They can't keep up. But let's talk about what decks fall in these categories. First up, we got my Grass Tier deck. So I will have Tier again on this list, as I think Tier in the 40 card classical sense and the 60 card combo sense are very, very different. They play extremely different, they're built very different, and you approach them very differently. But for all the reasons I mentioned before, this version of Tier belongs in the gutter. Alongside Plant Link, with Fugalos, Droll, and Breakers being crap, I think this deck is not where you want to be. So throw plants to the side. Sorry, Europe. Then we've also got the Pendulum Slop deck, which has been notorious as one of the most cancerous decks to face in the Duelist Cup, as it always seems to win the die roll and just obliterate opponents. I've lost to it many times. But with also the banning of Secret Village, the deck's end field has weakened, and it seems a little more open now. That being said, there are some people who love this deck with a passion, and I wouldn't be surprised if people really find a way to force this deck to be somewhat playable and sneak in maybe 1 or 2 top 100 finishes. Falling into the consistency issue category, I've got Fluanderies and Kashtira, 2 decks which, truth be told, when they pop off, can keep up in some sense, power level wise. They're just not consistent. So while Arise Heart and M-Pen with like Featherstorm and such are good, there's still the consistency problem I think holds them back. And in a long run tournament over many, many matches, I am not trying to play these decks. And then lastly, I've got a bunch of different decks here that I think are just power crap. They're not really feasible anymore. First up is Sky Striker. Now, this is probably the weirdest one to classify because I don't know if you really call it power creep, but I don't know. It's hard to say. Like, it's just not it. Even the hands where it feels like you pop off, you'll lose to follow-up sometimes. This deck's way of winning is to break the field and deal with a follow-up, and that's so hard to do. I know Ryan Yu got second in a YCS in a similar-ish format of the TCG, but even he'll tell you it was a miracle run where people played poorly against him. And you know, the other big problem with this deck as well is you don't play hand traps. You're going to be playing a board breaker approach, so that's the best way to play it. And when you're playing Duelist Cup and you want to get games in as fast as you can, even though it's not the most important thing, sitting there for 20 minutes for a long Snake Eyes combo just to lose a lot of the games because you still can't beat Desiree, that's bad. The Fiends of the cards really give Sky Striker a hard time. And if Bistrol's in the metagame too that hits Ray, this deck's just not it. Moving on from decks that are really just power crept, Hurley, Vanquishal, Marincess, all these decks that could have been solid picks before are slowly getting eked out more and more as they don't do it. They may have some okay matchups, some good positionings, but they're weak to how powerful the other decks combos are, can't really play through it, and their boards aren't insta-wins or aren't nearly as strong as the others, so you're just at a straight-up disadvantage playing them. They may have the advantage of at least Vanquishal and Pearly not being as weak to Fugalas. So while that's everywhere, you only have to give 1 or 2 draws to make a powerful field. Vanquishal even less, truthfully. But alas, these are still decks that I think are something you should stay away from. Now moving up in the list, let's go over some poor choices for the event. Now the reasoning for these is largely similar. I think it's lesser extents of other decks do things better, or they're just power crept in some sort of fashion. And one of these is Mathmech. Mathmech is an example of one that fits multiple of these, because it lines up poorly into non-entry of the format. Pistols, Droll, Fugalas, all, if they're not popular, Mathmech can see even more success. Ash, no problem. Mathmech deals with that like it's a nothing. But when you go up against a Bestial or, a Droll, Mathmech guy starts sweating, and he's like, shit, what do I do? So, yeah. An entire weekend of that doesn't sound ideal. Next up is Branded. So Branded is one with a huge dedicated player base, and I'm sure still will have top 100 finishes. But unless you're an expert with this deck, I would avoid it. I think it's a poor choice. That's because similarly to the other 60 card combo decks, I just can't see spell-based combo decks being good into Silva and Desiree. They just seem so impossible to overcome. And no, this deck can deal with Droll sometimes. It's not the end of the world. And Bestials are good against the deck, but it's not game ending against this deck. Fugalas as well is one where it's good against this deck, but it's by no means broken. And overall, this deck is a lot more well balanced, and it's not going to have the same major pitfalls outside of, say, Desiree. I think that keeps it from being an absolute shit choice that you should stay away from and never play again. As well as Brandon's complexity to play against with its odd layering and non-linear sequencing means that when you're playing against tired players, you can often win games you have no reason to win should your opponent have just played properly. But that being said, it still maintains most of the pitfalls that the grass decks have, and for that reason, I really can't put it anything higher than a poor choice. Now, I've also got Melodious in this category. Melodious is one that I'm a fan of, and I included as a strong pick on the TCG not too long ago, largely because of its powerful combo of Et12 plus Aria, especially when you back it up with the Shuberta to deal with Fiendsmith cards. Now, while it may not seem it, the Melodious cards do have a weakness against Desiree. Shuberta can prevent it from happening sometimes, but if you can force Shuberta and the other disruptions first, then the Fiendsmith cards do just deal with the rest of the field. And while Fiendsmith has no other way to deal with your interactions, Snake-Eye can, especially if they play Axis Code Talker. Even beyond that, Snake-Eye to Bellstar doesn't target, and it gives them a plethora of options that do actually kind of deal with this deck. And they could also send up Appaloosa, something that doesn't really exist in TCG anymore, or doesn't exist, period, which prevents your Shuberta from ripping apart Fiendsmith combos, and overall means that you actually do have a weak spot versus Snake Eyes now. And what it means is Snake Eyes can break through your otherwise impenetrable fortress. The Great Wall of China, it's getting knocked down by Snake Eyes. And Melodious is, I think, a poor choice for that reason. And another deck released last year that tended to be pretty good was Ritual Beast, something that we saw have a lot of success in the last Duelist Cup, as a powerful combo deck to combat Tenpai with Colossus and Protoss, as well as being something that wasn't too intensive on special summoning if need be, so you could make half fields with like Steeds, and that was alright versus mid-range decks. That's what the format kinda was. There was a lot more positioning around the Tenpai threat. That meant more trap cards, that meant less wombo combos, and it was a good existence for Ritual Beast, which was very good versus this type of decks. It's very good in grind games because of the value you get from Nochi Drago and the Banishing of Laura. It's an incredible recyclability, its ability to dodge both targeting and destruction. But Fugalas is still effective against it, and despite being still powerful with wombo combos, it is hit by Droll, and other decks do combos just better. Now, Ritual Beast's biggest weakness in every format to me has always been not being very good in zero removal. Specifically, IP and SP has always felt like a huge interaction point that Ritual Beast struggled with. And that is like the bread and butter Snake Eyes combo, IP and SP. Backed up with some Omni Negates, Ritual Beast can't deal with that. And that's why I think Ritual Beast floundered for a long time in the TCG until Snake Eyes faded away. And once Snake-Eye came back, Ritual Beast never really saw the huge presence again. So I think this deck is a poor choice, and it probably will remain to be as long as Snake-Eye stays in existence, and until a more negation-based meta pops up again. Now next up I have Labyrinth. I want to specify Furniture Labyrinth, because I do think there are two different versions of this deck, each with a unique identity and way to approach them. I don't play versus the Trap Labyrinth deck the same way I approach a Furniture Labyrinth deck. This deck is a poor choice, as it plays a low-ish number of hand traps. It's not crazy low, but it's not crazy high either, and tries to win grind games in mid-range sort of fashion. It's typically very good against other slower-paced decks, as you outvalue your opponent, and you can win these grind games pretty effectively, and you can play a bit faster than the normal Labyrinth deck because of the furniture pieces and Arias. But the deck doesn't play enough hand traps to keep up against Snake-Eye, and without the crazy blowout that is Equation Cannon, it can sometimes feel impossible to beat that deck. As well as Labyrinth overall struggles versus the Fiendsmith cards. Tesserae, Lacrima, and Gravers give you such a robust source of constant value that can deal with your Labyrinth cards for the most part, kind of make it hard to keep up. It means that even when you are able to gain value or clear a field, the backswing can sometimes still just be too much for you to deal with. So for me, Labyrinth is a no-brainer, poor choice for this event. Now moving on into Chimera Fiendsmith. Now this is a deck that I'll admit I'm a bit biased towards, or biased against, and that I think this deck is not great. You could maybe put this a bit higher on this list, but to me, this deck always has lacked consistency. As with, say, any fusion deck, you can get choked on the fusion spell very easily. You'll draw hands that don't do anything very often. Now there are some opening hands with this deck that can feel invincible when you draw a good balance of fusion spells and fusion monsters, almost like the old Shaddoll deck, that are just not manageable to beat. Now, one thing I will note is it's kind of nice that versus all these high tempo hand traps like Droll, Maxi, and Fua try to get you to pass, this deck can make half fields pretty convincingly. Now the deck doesn't just play through them like it's nothing, but you can make fields that are okay and try eke out grind games. But still, the consistency thing really holds me back from giving this deck more credit, and it can't play like a huge suite of non-engine. It can play some, but not like a crazy amount. And for that, it's a poor choice. I still don't like this deck, although maybe that's just me being a bit biased. And then lastly, we've got Salamangreat, which is edged its way above Mirrencess, showing fire is the true best attribute right now. Salad to me has always been, or not always, but recently been a rather strong deck, where its turn 1 feels pretty good. You can play an impressive amount of non-engine to combat going second, and its grind game was pretty good, with Raging Phoenix being an insanely broken card, especially in Salamangreat with the Surge effect, Princess being good in other decks, but also insane even more so in Salad, and the deck can search Omni Negates like Salamangreat Roar and I guess Ash Blossom, where other decks usually couldn't do that. But now other decks have access to that ability, so there's no longer an edge, as well as Fuwalas exists, because Salamangreat's biggest problem always holding it back was Maxi. The deck had no good answer to it. Fuwalas, same thing. And now maybe you can say, oh, you make half fields better into Fuwalas, but don't kid yourself. It's like half field, give your opponent 3 draws. Like, that's not good enough, man. Salad already was a bit low in terms of power level, so a half field in that deck, giving your opponent 3 draws is a death sentence. But that wraps up the decks that I think are poor choices in this metagame. Next up, I have a bunch of different decks I think are playable choices. Now, let's note here that I think this tier and then the next tier, the strong choices, as well as the best decks, are the decks I expect to see take up spots in the top 100. Because of that, I think there are a bunch of different decks that can cope at a relatively high level, and it leaves a rather wide meta, although the top is still pretty small. I'm going to be starting off with tier. Now, this is referring to a 40 card tier variant, specifically with Fiendsmith cards, obviously. The reason I think this deck is still playable is you can play some mounts on engine to help you cope in the format, and the deck's power level is still very high, as well as with Beatrice and Kentkalos and Snow still existing, you can make solid fields with an incredible grind game potential, meaning when people get into hand trap wars, you can just outvalue hand traps without even needing them yourself. To me, this deck also synergizes very well with Bestials, as it really goes in with that kind of strategy of using the Fiendsmith cards and get the Link fodder online, as well as making Beatrice such a mainstay in this deck. Now, this deck also can deal with cards like Fuwalas and Droll significantly better than other combo decks, because it's not really a combo deck, and you can very conveniently put this deck into the mid-range fashion. That's the beauty of tier. You can play grind games so well. best deck ever made for a reason. So yeah, while I think this deck can be a little lacking in non-engine, it still is a pretty powerful choice with plenty of flexibility that I think will have some representation in the top 100. Now next up is a newer deck that I might be underrating, although I still think this deck isn't all it's cut out to be, and that is White Forest Azamina. Now the newest wave of White Forest support from Supreme Darkness in the TCG was ported immediately in alongside the Azamina cards into Master Duel. So that means LZ Azamina of the White Forest is there, as well as the other new Sinful Spoil cards. All that sets up White Forest to be a pretty powerful deck, which you can see me playing on the highlight channel. Its end field is pretty good. Synchro still exists like Baron, which done in the TCG, which really amplify the power of any Synchro deck, as well as you still have the Omnis from Ilya Silva. You have fusion potential with your quick play Sinful Spoil spell. You have the Book Field with Silvera. Its disruptions are brilliant. But what holds it back for me is this deck has always felt rough into removal going second, similar to Ritual Beast. Its turn 1 is fantastic and it's somewhat resilient, but removal has always been a problem. Where if you can cut off tuners, it kind of crumbles. And this deck can't fit in like crazy amounts of non-engine. It's still like similar to the Snake-Eye deck in terms of the non-engine fits in. And in reality, it's just the same deck as the Snake-Eye Azamina Fiendsmith deck to replace the Snake-Eyes with White Force cards. But I think those cards are just worse. They don't bridge and synergize as cleanly with the Azamina Fiendsmith cards as Snake-Eye do. And that kind of clunkiness, as well as just not being as powerful as Snake-Eyes, does mean that I think this deck is just not as good as people think it is. And we'll see if its time ever comes, especially as we know new support is coming out as it's a lore deck, and who knows how long we'll get these cards for. Next up is Centurion. So Centurion is the classic mid-range deck of the last few months. It's a good deck. It is very good at consistently putting up boards of several disruptions with minimal commitment and with minimal risk into disruption. That includes cards like Maxi, Voltron Fuelos, and Joel Lockbird. And that makes it fantastic because you feel like you're somewhat in control of almost every game. You're also not particularly weak to combo decks because you can play a large amount of non-engine and hand traps to keep them at bay. This deck though is not flawless. We've seen for a while, and the reason why it struggles to take major tournaments in the TCG, for one, it's consistency. It has consistent pieces, but it misses a little bit more oomph. That often means you need to play supplementary engines like Visceral cards to make it all come together. And still, even then, the deck is pretty weak into removal. It's not like death to removal, like it doesn't just auto lose, but there are some games where you can't beat a single SP because you just can't. For me, this is the perfect type of deck to do well with, but not to climb all the way to the top. But still, I want you to give credit where credit is due. Next up is Rescue Ace. So this may be, again, me hating a bit, but this is my least favorite of all the Snake Eyes variants, if you can even call it Snake Eyes. But this deck has seen some popularity, as with the Azamina cards, you have more access to Hydrant, and Fiendsmith cards as well for the same reason. It's just a Snake Eye variant for all intents and purposes, but with Rescue Ace cards instead. And because of how dense the Rescue Ace package tends to be, these decks end up being 50-60 cards. However, this does mean a decreased density of drawing powerful cards like Call By, Maxi, and Fuelos. I don't love because those cards are very, very powerful right now. As well as with Rescue Ace, and the reason why you have to play so many cards is you have a lot of engine requirements and bricks in the deck that really suck the draw. I really just like having to play the Rescue Ace trap cards in Rescue Ace deck because, damn, it sucks. Now, the one edge to this deck is in theory you're better into cards like Maxi and Fuelos because Turbulence can get through by itself, as well as Droll, depending on the hand, can just do nothing. But I just really have been a big anti-Rescue Ace person, as the deck can be a little bricky with the big Rescue Ace monsters not always being the best card to draw. And I don't like how playing above 40 cards means you're not going to see your powerful non-engine as much. For me, this is playable because it still plays the best engines in the game. It's just worse than the other decks, so I don't know why you do it, but yeah, Rescue Ace is playable. Now next up is Voiceless Voice, the classic and one of the higher win rate decks from the last Duelist Cup. Now, I don't think this deck is that good, truthfully, and I'm putting it pretty high on the list still, but I think it's overrated because I know many players would put this higher. For me, even in the last cup, it was just around this position. It was a playable deck, it could do well, get top 100. If you're trying to win, this wasn't it. I think it has several flaws. For one, it's not always that consistent. It's a ritual deck, so it'll draw clunky hands where you have too many spells or not enough spells. And it means you're required to play a rather dense engine. So actually, compared to other mid-range decks or even Snake Eyes, you can't play as many non-engine or hand trap cards. meaning you can struggle going second or you have to rely on your engine more. And the Voiceless Voice engine isn't terrible going second. The Omni Negate into fields and the targeting protection can actually be pretty good, but it's not brilliant either. There are many games where you'll just completely collapse. All these factors kind of make it hard for me to be a Voiceless Voice fan. However, deck is still pretty strong. Just turn 1 is pretty good, especially when you draw all the pieces together. The original Voiceless Voice field was more manageable with the continuous trap, the continuous spell, and the Skull Guardian, but also with the Sarvis and the new continuous spell, but that gives you the extra ritual summon on the opponent's turn. It does become too much to handle. So I do think it has that going for it, as well as obviously Maxi and Droll and Lockbird aren't going to be a big problem for this deck. Maxi can sometimes stop you, and I mean, like, that huge field I talked about does give a bunch of summons, and half fields are very comfortable for Voiceless Voice. In that sense, Voiceless is decently positioned, but still, just the nature of the deck for me is something I try to avoid, so it's just going to be a playable choice for now. And moving up is another bolder choice for me, and that's Gimmick Puppet. It's one that I struggled to get a read on. I wasn't sure how well it would do in the last Duels Cup, and it did all right. It took several spots in the top 100, I believe, and as I was grinding that tournament, I played versus a fair bit of them, and it's frustrating. And we talk about how broken Sanguine Summoning is with the field spell just making everything immune, and Gimmick Puppet field spell is the same thing, and in FTK form for that matter. And that can mean cards like Fubulos and Maxi, you just don't force them to pass, especially if people start cutting their other hand traps, make space for more tempo ones. A lot of the people will pass in fear of their board being broken, where you don't need to have that worry with puppets because you can't imperm, can't draw into Veilers. There's not much you can draw into. Eventually it'll be Droll, but it might be too late by the time it gets around. I truly don't know how bad Droll is into this deck. I haven't played it enough to really say. I can't imagine it's that good though. I imagine the Droll still hurts a fair bit, and that does hurt its positioning in the game, as well as going second. It's never an easy matter to approach Snake-Eye going second. For me, this deck is a weird choice where it's incredible power going first, and its ability to sometimes just steal when it's going second means I do think it might take a playable choice position and take some spots top 100, but I don't think it's going to be a breakaway star that just does excellent. Next up, I got Sprite as another playable choice in the metagame, and this is partially because Swap Frog's returning to 3, and that's cool. Now, the thing with this deck is going first, it can put up pretty powerful fields. It's not Snake Eyes, but it can feel similar-ish with Omni Negates from the Sprite monsters, IP and SP still, as well as you can continue bolster with cards like Seal Hat Rabbit. And with Swap Frog back in the meta, you can also search Maxi if you already do the Swap Frog. That's pretty good. The deck can also play a large number of hand traps, and that's obviously good in a metagame like this, as well as it means when you Maxi them, if you search it, you'll draw into cards to defend yourself from dying. Now, the reason this deck isn't better is Toad is still banned, so Swap Frog and Ronin Toadin, while being good, aren't going to be like insane, as well as the age-old issue of Sprite still exists, where if you're able to keep Sprite off of the field, it doesn't have the best extenders to push through it. They have Sprite starter, or they Swap Frog with a water in hand, neither of which are that reliable, and there are also some decks that can play through the Sprite field. But that being said, if everyone's playing more mid-range or combo type decks, then the half fields the Sprites produce that are effective against hand traps should be sufficient. As well as Droll is a card that isn't very good against this deck, and I think that's an upside as well. So I think this deck can actually be in a decent position as a solid mid-range deck. I just don't know if it is powerful enough to sit at a higher rank. But next up, I got the other version of Labyrinth, Trap Labyrinth or Math Labyrinth. This deck is taking on the scary approach of trying to beat Snake Eyes with Engine. You heard that right. But by Engine, I mean trap cards. So I consider the traps in this deck as Engine because you play no hand traps or whatever, and trying to combo together multi-powered traps like Solemn Strike and Roger the Warlords, Daruma Cannon, or Simultaneous Equation Cannon to rip apart the Snake Eye player's field and follow-up. And it can happen, even going second, especially in tandem with cards like Sphere Mode or Lava Golem to deal with the Omnis. I think this deck has a better chance going second against the Snake Eyes deck, as well as going first. You have less vulnerability to cards like Veiler and Imperm in the game, and that works to your favor. As well as with the obvious that with so many traps in your deck and no real engine or power like combos, everyone's Maxis and Fubulos do, well, nothing against you. Droll too. When your opponent's playing down several cards, that's fantastic. So when this deck goes first, it's very convincing, and it can win going second. The biggest thing holding it back is, for one, some games can be long grind games, and that's rough, because if you lose that, it can take a toll on your mental health for the Duels Cup, as well as be a big waste of time. And even if you're able to clear a field, it doesn't mean you can auto win the game, as a skilled Snake-Eye opponent should be able to cycle their face of the cards effectively, as well as use Divine Temple, as well as Snake-Eye to Bellstar to give constant pressure that truthfully Labyrinth struggles with. And it doesn't really get any easier for this deck as opposed to Furniture. Yes, it's not as big a deal if your Lovely gets Lock Spell Trap Card Zone in the Math versions deck as it is for the Furniture version, but it's still not nice. And this deck, it struggles to find the space for cards like adding Mr. Packbit to unlock it, which would be your answer in the Furniture version. Still, I think it can win against Snake Eyes, especially if you play it properly and get a bit fortunate. When you go first, you're pretty comfortable. So I think this deck is a solid playable choice for the event. Now I have one last deck as a playable choice for this event, and then I move on to the strong choices that are well positioned, that I think can really edge the top echelons of the event and have some surprise success. The last deck in the playable choice section is Blue Eyes. I'm sorry, all of my fans who wanted to see Blue Eyes as a strong choice in the metagame, and it'll be interesting to see how the ensemble of Blue Eyes deals against the horde of Snake Eyes duelists. I have a feeling that Blue Eyes will not fare too well. To me, this deck is similar to Centurion, where you have some bricks in the deck, truthfully more than Centurion, which is more than I'd like, and you play pretty well into a lot of hand traps. Maxi's kind of poo, but Blue Loss is manageable. A lot of hand traps you can deal just fighting against Ash Imperm. You know, they do stuff, but they're not like huge. You can play a large number of non-engines, so you can play going second well, and you try enter a grind game and value-based games where your True Light, your Maiden of Whites, Spirit Dragon really go for all that value. And similarly to Centurion, you have this ability to put up Omni Negates with your ultimate Spirit Dragon. You have the removal, like with Phalanx, you have your Blue Eyes Trap. So the deck has a lot of merit to it, but to me it feels similar to Centurion. It's just the same type of thing. And unlike the TCG, importantly, no Primite cards, which is another aspect of the grind game that helps out Blue Eyes a lot of the TCG, as well as it gives it further interruptions and negations to let it cope versus the wide variety of decks in the meta. This deck is by no means a unplayable or bad deck, so I wouldn't just brush this off as something to not expect. And especially with its popularity, I would not be surprised if several of these made the top 100 and if it was popular, but I don't expect it to be one of the strongest choices or best decks for the event. But that brings us to the decks that I feel like are strong choices that can be good for this event. Now, the first deck I want to talk about is kind of not really a deck. It's Bestial Fiendsmith as a Mina. This is pretty much the equivalent of the Bestial Fiendsmith type of deck that we had in the TCG pretty recently. The idea here is you cut out the other engines like Snake Eyes or White Forest to contribute bricks and clogginess to the deck, and you let the Fiendsmith and Bestials do the heavy lifting in grind games. Because of this, you play a large number of non-engine, and you really force the grind game in a way that this deck wants, and you win the resource battle. The upside to this is your deck is in theory more consistent. You can play a lot more going second cards, and that helps a lot. Now, there are some variants of this deck that don't play as Mina cards. It's not considered mandatory. What those do is just give you a little more proactiveness in terms of giving bodies to convert into Fiendsmiths or into other plays past Fiendsmiths, because without Lacrima and Necroquip, or the level 4 Lacrima, you can't do things with just Fiendsmiths alone. It will also give you the Omni Negate with Ilya Silva and even more forms of follow-up, because again, you lose a little bit by not having the level 4 Lacrima in your deck. But you can opt without it or play other supplementary engines instead, like more Kashtira cards, which can or cannot be included in the other version of the deck, or Magical Musketeer cards, more like Fiends. But with all that, you're also going to be playing less powerful engine. It means you can't pull off crazy combos. And it means sometimes you'll play against people who drew no hand traps, and you'll lose to them because their engine overpowers you. You can't stop it. Because your end field it's like Ilya Silva Caesar sometimes, or just Desiree, or an IP plus an Ilya Silva. It's a lot more lacking. And when you back it up with hand traps and your opponent burns their own hand traps in their turn, you get into the grind game, that's fantastic. But there are some games where you will just lose, where if you'd just gone first in normal Snake-Eye Ash, you would have won on the spot. And that can always feel a little weird. As well as when you play versus higher engine decks, like Fire King, or Rescue Ace even, or Tyr, which play still non-engine and engines, they're not full-on combo decks. They have an easy time pushing through your midfields because they're not built to last against everything. They're built to be like just enough versus the Snake-Eye decks, or the Fiendsmith Snake-Eye deck, and that's about it. So when they have that little bit of extra push past, it gets a little complicated. Still, I think this deck is a solid pick, as it can be very good in grind games. It can feel very consistent. It's not glaringly weak to anything and can hold its own across the board. Now, the next deck is a deck that I just mentioned, and that is Fire King Snake-Eye. This is a deck I considered putting up at the top, and it's one with a bit of bias for myself, as I really love this deck, and I think it is one of the most interesting to play, as every game can feel kind of different, and you will pivot your combos, you'll pivot your disruptions, largely based on how your opponent plays and interacts. Now, part of why I like this deck is how it plays into Multi-Charming Fuwalas. This is the deck that I made the top cut of the Hollow Live tournament with, because over the course of the tournament, I didn't want to get Fuwalast and have to concede. And as I said, it's not a big problem in this deck. Now, you may say, why? That's because Garunix is so powerful that even a simple field of Princess plus Bravado plus Garunix and giving your opponent 2 draws can keep your opponent at bay for a turn. A lot of the time, you're playing without Snake-Eye cards in this way, because the Fire King cards are very powerful. It's not like they're bad. This engine holds its own very well. This deck also can play going second very well because the Fire King cards are fantastic in the fields, being great to push through disruption and to destroy your opponent's cards and go for lethal shots pretty easily. This all comes with the downside though, and the biggest downside here is that you can't play as much non-engine. Now, it may seem like a direct negative that you can't play as much non-engine, but the truth is when you're playing against other people who have a lot of non-engine, being able to play cards like Kieran and Garunix means that now you can sometimes play through 3 or 4 hand traps, where other Snake Eyes decks can't do that as often. So that trade-off can equalize itself where you end up being better into the hand traps. And I think that is worth something. As well as versus half fields, because you only had 1 or 2 hand traps, you have more gas to push through them. I think this deck is still just incredibly underrated. It's so powerful. That being said, it's a bit harder to pilot, I'll give it that much, and it can also crumble to its own consistency sometimes. It's by no means the perfect deck. I'm putting it as a strong choice that can easily win the cup or do very well, but at the end of the day, I still think the other Snake-Eye variants will edge it out. Now, moving on, we got one other deck on this list that is pretty similar to Snake-Eye. It is Duel. Yeah, not actually a Snake-Eye deck, but we've always called it like a Snake-Eye deck in disguise because it plays very similar. And yeah, I mean, this deck is very good. The old problem with Duel has been alleviated, where you had no spell interruptions. Now you have Ardress, but also have Desiree. It's just like Snake-Eye in that way. As well as this deck has gotten better from face with cards. It's a good deck, and Duel always has the nice upside to it where it's been pretty good at skill checking players, where it's kind of obscure card design in some ways, like the no destruction by battle, the force to attack, the reflecting damage, can beat players who are either tired, mentally drained, or just not experienced against Duel. That being said, I do think this deck can play a little less non-engine than Snake Eyes. It plays a little worse into disruption than Snake Eyes. It's a little less consistent than Snake Eyes, and it's a little worse at killing than Snake Eyes. All those factors make Snake Eye, I think, clearly the better deck, but Duel's pretty much the same thing, just slightly worse in like every way, except for the skill check way, I think. But alas, deck is still very good, and I would not be surprised if it wins the cup or does very well. Expect to see a lot of Duel, even if it's not as represented as the Snake Eye decks. Now, I still have 2 more picks for strong choices for the event that I think are going to be a bit of a surprise and take several spots in the top ranks. Now, one of these is Stun. Now, if you've been keeping up with Mashable lately, this may not be that much of a surprise, as several players in the top 10 played Stun in the February ranked season. And Stun only gets better. The Stun, why play it? Well, the reason is, going first, you're not going to be to Fuwalash, you're not going to be to Droll, you're not going to be to Maxi, and that's always fantastic. Same thing as before, except now more dead cards are going to be in the deck against you. Some players aren't even playing 3 Imperm, myself included, and that's obviously very good for Stun. People aren't playing as much Tenpai, so less board breakers like Duster or Lightning Storm are going to be thrown in your face. As well as with the element of surprise, if people don't know you're playing Stun, which they shouldn't in Mashable, you can get away with your opponent making half fields or building fields that are inefficient against you, and you're able to claw back and claim victory against them. But this deck did also get another form of support that is a little bit frustrating, to be honest, and that is 7th Tachyon. So this may not seem like direct support, but you can reveal a giant hand to add a level 4 Earth or Rock to your hand, and guess what is both of those? Fossil Dyna. So when Fossil Dyna just got restricted, we now have a way to re-access Fossil Dyna at any time. That's not something I'm happy about. It's Rise of support in the future, but until we get that, it's direct Stun support. I think Stun is actually a pretty strong choice, and we'll see several spots among the top. And for that, I'm not looking forward to it. But yeah, it should be a strong contender in the upcoming cups. Now, lastly, this is the last deck to talk about in my strong choices and last deck overall for this tier list. But for the last deck here is a deck that is also seeing some bit of success in Master Duel Ranked, where we didn't see have success in the TCG. And that is pure Millennium. Now, this is an interesting one because Secret Village has been banned, so it's not even an option you can play here, but still, this deck tends to work well as a stun deck. It can play cards like Macrocosmos, Dimensional Fissure, or just traps and hand traps that are very strong. And obviously, you back this up with the unstoppable Exodia Incarnate, which is not like the most broken unstoppable card ever, despite its name, but it is a very good card, where it can one-shot people if they leave themselves exposed. It can set up a Regeki and spell a trap negate, which is good. Those are powerful. They're definitely way above average card quality. They may not be like Flamer's level broken, but it's good. And it has the upside of not being particularly weak to Maxi. It's not like it's great into Fugalos. It's overall actually pretty solid. And it has this nice benefit right now, or you can even say this Millennium Snake-Eye has a nice benefit, where because the Millennium cards are being used in other decks, sometimes your Millennium cards don't get ashed. And similarly, if you're playing the Snake-Eye deck, people may ash your Sengagen thinking you're playing Millennium, when they're not, but still, the whole mind game thing works to both decks' favor as it creates uncertainty, and any uncertainty can be played to your advantage, as it can sometimes let you win games you have no right to win. But alas, it's one of my favorite things about this deck is that you can use cards like Maxi or end your opponent's turn. If they end on a weak card, then slam down Exodia, and they just lose. Now, the biggest thing holding us back is its consistency. It's not amazing going second either, but you can play hand traps, and Exodia Incarnate's not terrible going second, depending on how your opponent has interruptions. My biggest thing here is we forced to play 5 bricks, 5 Exodia pieces. It's still the same problem as before. It sucks to draw those. So I think this deck can actually do pretty well, and I do expect to take several spots in the top 100. And I think that if anywhere Millennium has a chance to shine, it is now in Master Duel. But that brings the tier list to an end. Let me know what you guys think of my rankings. As the format progresses and I learn more about the decks I said I need more data on, things may change or shift a bit. I will hopefully be playing the Cup myself, where I'll be streaming it live on Twitch. As for which deck I'm going to play, I haven't decided yet. Probably Snake-Eye, Fiendsmith, Millennium. Maybe some Fire King, because I love that deck and I think it's pretty good. Maybe Blue Eyes, because for the viewers. But that remains to be seen, and we'll see kind of more how the meta progresses, as well as with the Duelist Cup. You can always build multiple decks and switch between, depending on how the meta moves and evolves. But anyways, guys, that's it for now. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you all at the Duelist Cup. Good luck. Journey to becoming a world champion. Peace.